The bench by the train station that everyone thought was just wood. And I still remember the exact moment the metal plaque on the backrest came loose in my hand, revealing a hollowed-out compartment containing a single house key and a slip of paper with my own name written on it. My name is Caleb Vance, and after 20 years away from Ashwood, Pennsylvania, building bridges, repairing highways, and trying desperately to outrun the ghosts of a family name whisper about with a mixture of pity and contempt, I had returned for one reason only, to settle my uncle's estate and sell off the crumbling family homestead before the winter frost set in. The small town hadn't changed much. The air still smelled of damp pine, coal dust, and distant rain, and the red brick station where the 6:15 morning commuter train used to groan to a halt still stood like a lonely sentinel beside the rusted tracks. But as I sat down on that green-painted wooden bench to wait for the local real estate agent, my fingers brushed against a loose brass screw on the commemorative plaque dedicated to my grandfather. When the metal plate pivoted sideways, it didn't just expose a rusty cavity. It exposed a trapdoor into a past I thought was safely buried beneath 2 decades of silence. The slip of paper inside didn't just bear my name. It carried an address 3 miles outside of town, a farmhouse that the county maps claimed had burned to ground the very night my father disappeared in 1998. I stared down at the small slip of heavy cardstock, the ink of my name, Caleb Vance, written in a sharp, hurried script that looked eerily like my own handwriting when I was rushing through drafting class in high school. My pulse ticked up a notch, a cold drop of sweat tracing down my spine, despite the crisp autumn breeze rolling off the Allegheny foothills. For 20 years, the official story in Ashwood was clean and neat, wrapped up in a tidy police report and filed away in a dusty drawer at the county courthouse. My father, Daniel Vance, had torched our ancestral farmhouse in the dead of winter, collected whatever cash he could squeeze from a fraudulent insurance claim, and abandoned me to my uncle before vanishing into the midnight mist. He was a gambler, a drunk, and according to the whispers that followed me through the school hallways, a coward who left his son behind to face the wreckage. I had spent 2 decades building bridges of steel and concrete precisely because I was terrified of the rot in my own foundation. I slid the slip of paper and the heavy brass key into my coat pocket just as a rusted blue sedan sputtered to a halt by the station curb, horn wheezing a pathetic greeting. It was Brenda Gable, the town's sole remaining real estate agent, her hair teased into a stiff blonde helmet that hadn't surrendered to fashion trends since the Reagan administration. Caleb Vance. Well, look at you, all grown up and looking like a man who owns a tape measure, Brenda called out, leaning across the passenger seat to push the sticky door open. Hop in, honey. We got the appraisal at the old property line by noon, and trust me, nobody in Ashwood is lining up to buy a homestead with a history like yours. I pulled the heavy passenger door of Brenda's sedan shut, the old plastic interior smelling faintly of stale peppermints and cheap pine air freshener. As she threw the car into drive with a sharp crunch of the transmission, gravel spit from beneath the tires, and we bounced away from the red brick train station. So, Caleb, 20 years is a long time to stay away from God's country, Brenda said, her eyes darting between the winding 2-lane blacktop and the rear-view mirror as if half the town was watching our movements. Most folks who leave Ashwood with a Vance last name find a reason to change it, or at least stay across the state line. You must have a strong stomach coming back to deal with the probate court. My uncle left the property to me. Brenda, I'm just here to sign the deed over to whoever's buying the timber rights, clear out the attic, and head back to Pittsburgh. I said, keeping my voice flat and unreadable, staring out the window at the familiar skeletal frame of the valley. Timber rights. Brenda let out a sharp, dry laugh that sounded like dry leaves scraping across asphalt. Honey, nobody's buying the timber out on Ridge Road. That land's been tied up in municipal zoning disputes since your father's fire. The bank owns the paper, but the town council acts like they hold the deed to your soul. I kept my hand buried deep in my coat pocket, my fingers wrapped tightly around the cold brass key and the mysterious slip of paper. Ridge Road. The address written on the paper wasn't a burned-out ruin. It was an active parcel, just 3 miles past the old limestone quarry. I thought the homestead burned completely to the ground. I said casually, turning my head to look at her. The insurance photo showed a pile of ash and charred timber. Brenda's hands tightened on the steering wheel for a fraction of a second, her knuckles whitening against the cracked vinyl. That's what the fire chief wrote in his report. But out here in the hills, Caleb, things don't always burn the way people say they do. Sometimes the frame stays, standing long after the people inside are gone. She hit the turn signal, slowing the car down as we approached the rusted iron gates of the Vance property line. The heavy metal sign hanging from the post, Vance and Son Carpentry, was battered and covered in moss, but as we rolled past it and headed up the winding dirt driveway through the dense pine forest, my breath caught in my throat. The house wasn't a pile of ash. Through the windshield, half hidden by thick, overgrown brush and weeping willow trees, stood a 2-story timber farmhouse. Smoke was lazily curling from the stone chimney. Brenda slammed her foot on the brake pedal, the sedan skidding a few feet on the wet gravel before lurching to a dead stop. Her mouth was slightly open, her eyes wide behind her thick-rimmed glasses as she stared up through the windshield at the house on the hill. That's impossible," she whispered, her voice losing its usual brash confidence, replaced by a sudden jittery edge of fear. The county records state the structure was condemned and completely leveled in 1998. The insurance payout was logged, investigated, and closed. I sold the adjacent timber rights to the County Water Authority 10 years ago under the assumption that plot was nothing more than a grassy crater. I didn't answer her. I reached for the door handle, pushed it open, and stepped out onto the damp earth. The air here was different, heavier, smelling intensely of wood smoke, wet pine needles, and the iron tang of the nearby creek. The house before us wasn't a charred ruin. It was weathered, gray with age, but structurally intact, its front porch swept clean of leaves, a pair of worn rubber boots sitting neatly beside the screen door. "Caleb, don't go up there," Brenda called out from the open car window, her voice pitching up with real panic. "If someone's squatting on county property, or if the bank finds out, God knows what kind of trouble follows a Vance around this town. Let's just turn around, call the sheriff, and let Henderson handle it." "Henderson?" I turned my head, looking back at her over the roof of the car. "Arthur Henderson? Is he still running the bank?" "His son, Thomas, took over the bank years ago, but the family keeps all the old files," Brenda stammered, gripping the steering wheel. "Just be careful, Caleb. Ashwood hasn't forgotten your father." I didn't wait for her to say another word. I turned my back on the car and started walking up the overgrown gravel path toward the front porch. Every step felt heavy, like I was walking backward through time. My father's shadow seemed to stretch out from the dark, double-hung windows, watching my approach. I reached the bottom of the wooden steps, the old oak boards groaning under my boots just as they had 20 years ago. I walked across the porch, pulled the brass key out of my coat pocket, and stared at the heavy deadbolt on the front door. My hands weren't shaking anymore. A cold, absolute clarity had taken over. I slid the key into the lock. It didn't resist or catch on rusted pins. It turned smoothly, satisfyingly, with a heavy mechanical click that echoed to the silent forest. I pushed the door open, stepping past the threshold into the dark, timber-frame hallway, and called out into the empty house. "I'm here," I said, my voice echoing off the paneled walls. "Now tell me who left the key." The heavy oak door swung inward, releasing a wave of warm air laden with the scent of aged cedar, black coffee, and pipe tobacco, a scent I hadn't smelled since the winter of my 10th year, the exact scent that had belonged exclusively to my father. I stepped across the threshold into the dimly lit hallway, the floorboards murmuring beneath my boots. The interior looked nothing like the gutted, ash-choked ruin described in the county's official insurance reports from 1998. Framed blueprints of old Ashwood bridges lined the walls. A heavy wool coat hung neatly from the brass rack by the stairs. A yellow legal pad sat open on a small writing desk, featuring a sketch of a timber-frame joint drawn in ink that looked remarkably fresh. "Hello," I called out again, my voice bouncing sharply off the high-vaulted ceiling. "I know someone is here. Show yourself." From the back of the house, past the kitchen, and down the short corridor toward my father's old workshop, a floorboard creaked. It wasn't the hurried step of an intruder or the clumsy movement of a transient squatting in an abandoned building. It was a slow, measured, heavy tread, the precise gait of a man who knew every nail and knot in the framing. A shadow detached itself from the doorway of the workshop, stepping out into faint afternoon light, filtering through the dust-moated windows. My breath caught in my throat. My legs felt suddenly rooted to the floorboards. Standing before me wasn't a ghost, and it wasn't a stranger. It was a man with deep, weathered lines carved into his face, wearing a faded plaid flannel shirt and silver-streaked hair pulled back into a loose ponytail. But the eyes, pale, piercing, and unmistakably blue, were the exact same eyes I saw every time I looked in the mirror. "You're late, Caleb," my father said, his voice raspy and worn down by decades of silence, yet carrying the same quiet authority I remembered from my childhood. "I left that key in the station bench 3 days ago. I was beginning to think you'd lost your taste for old timber." I stared at him, the 20 years of anger, abandonment, and bitter grief crashing over me like a tidal wave, completely stripping away my speech. "You're dead." I finally choked out, the words tasting like copper in my mouth. "The police report, the insurance investigators, the whole town said you burned this place down and ran off with the payout after county foreclosed on us." Daniel Vance let out a slow, tired sigh, walking over to the small writing desk and picking up a ceramic coffee mug that was still warm to the touch. "The town didn't lie about the fire, Caleb," my father said quietly, looking me dead in the eye. "They just lied about who ordered it, and why I had to disappear into the woods while my own house burned to the ground." I stood in the center of the hallway, the space between my father and me feeling like a chasm carved out by 20 years of lies, ghost stories, and a manufactured grave. "You burned the house down?" I repeated, my voice dropping into a dangerous, shaking register as I took a slow step toward him. "You let the entire county brand you a criminal, a thief, and a coward? You left me with an uncle who looked at me like I carried a plague, all while you were hiding out 3 miles up the ridge playing hermit?" My father didn't flinch. He didn't drop his gaze or raise his voice. He took a slow sip from his ceramic mug, the steam curling upward in the dim light of the hallway, before setting it back down on the wooden desk with a soft clink. "I didn't burn it for the insurance money, Caleb," my father said, his pale blue eyes locking onto mine with an unyielding gravity. "I burned it because the bank examiners were coming the next morning with a court order to seize every ledger, every survey map, and every engineering draft your grandfather left behind when he designed the Ashwood municipal water dam back in 1956. I stopped mid-step, my brow furrowing as the anger momentarily warred with confusion. "The municipal dam? What does a 50-year-old dam have to do with you faking your own death and living like a ghost?" "Everything," a new voice interrupted sharply from the open front doorway behind me. I spun around. Standing on the threshold, framed by the pale autumn light of the porch, was Brenda Gable. But she wasn't cowering in her sedan anymore. She had her phone out, recording every inch of the hallway, her face hardened into an expression of grim, unavoidable realization. "Brenda, what are you—" I started, but she cut me off, stepping past me into the house and looking directly at my father. "Thomas Henderson, Sr. didn't just want your timber land, Daniel," Brenda said, her voice dropping its usual bubbly small-town cadence, revealing a sharp, professional edge I had never heard before. "He wanted the original stress calculations for the concrete footings under the spillway, because if the town council ever found out the dam was built on a shifting shale shelf that's scheduled to give way the next time we get a prolonged spring thaw, the Ashwood savings and trust will be sued into bankruptcy overnight." My father nodded slowly, looking at Brenda without a trace of surprise. "And that's why they needed the Vance name disgraced," he said quietly. "A dead man can't testify in court about structural fraud, and a son raised with a tarnished name would never dare look too closely at the town's foundation." Before I could process the staggering weight of the revelation, a heavy, metallic crunch echoed from the end of the long driveway outside. Through the front windows, headlights flared through the trees, illuminating the yard in a harsh, clinical white glare. A sleek, late-model black SUV with municipal tags was barreling up the gravel path, followed closely by 2 county sheriff cruisers. "They tracked your phone, Caleb," Brenda hissed, her face draining of color as she lowered her device. "Thomas Henderson, Jr. just brought the whole county down on us." The heavy thud of multiple car doors slamming shut outside reverberated through the timber walls of the old farmhouse. Footsteps, fast, heavy, and purposeful, crunched aggressively across the gravel driveway, moving toward the front porch with the unyielding momentum of a legal machine. "They're at the door," Brenda whispered, her eyes darting frantically toward the back windows, as if calculating an escape route through the dense pine forest. "Caleb, if Henderson finds Daniel here, they won't just arrest him for insurance fraud from 20 years ago. They'll bury him in a cell under a terrorism statute to keep those damn reports from ever seeing daylight." My father didn't panic. He walked calmly over the corner of the hallway, reached up, and pushed aside a heavy, framed blueprint of the Ashwood River Bridge. Behind it wasn't a wall, but a recessed panel with a heavy steel lever. "The records aren't here in the house, Caleb," my father said, pulling the lever down with a solid, satisfying clunk. A section of the floorboards beneath the staircase hissed, unlatching and sliding back to reveal a dark, stone-lined descending stairwell lit by a faint amber glow from below. "They're in the dry drainage conduit your grandfather built beneath the spillway foundation. That's why I couldn't leave this ridge. I wasn't hiding from the fire. I was standing guard over the spillway." Before I could answer, a loud, violent pounding rattled the heavy front door off its hinges. "Open the door! This is the Ashwood County Sheriff's Department and Municipal Property Enforcement. Step away from the structure immediately," a booming voice commanded through a megaphone from the porch. "Go, Dad," I said, my voice dropping into a hard, unyielding register. I reached out and grabbed the edge of the secret stairwell door, holding it steady. "Go down to the conduit. Get the original stress charts. I'll handle the front door." My father hesitated for a fraction of a second, his weathered hand resting briefly on my shoulder, a gesture of pride and forgiveness compressed into a single second. Then, without a word, he descended into the dark stone passage, pulling the sliding floor panel shut above him with a quiet, seamless click just as the front door gave way under a brutal, splintering kick from the sheriff's deputies outside. The heavy wooden front door splintered inward with a deafening crack, with fragments spraying across the polished floorboards of the hallway. I didn't flinch. I stepped back, putting my weight squarely over the hidden floor panel where my father had just ascended into the darkness, and turned to face the three figures storming into the house. Leading the pack was Thomas Henderson, Jr., the current president of the Ashwood Savings and Trust, his tailored overcoat slightly askew, his face flushed with a mixture of corporate panic and unbridled fury. Right behind him were two county sheriff's deputies, their hands hovering nervously over their service holsters as they swept the room with tactical flashlights. "Hold right there. Don't move a muscle," the lead deputy shouted, sweeping his beam directly into my eyes. I raised a hand to block the harsh light, squinting as I stood my ground. "You're breaking and entering without a warrant, gentlemen. Last I checked, private property still required due process, even in Ashwood." Henderson pushed past the deputy, his wire-rimmed glasses catching the dim indoor light. He looked around the meticulously kept hallway, at the blueprints on the walls, the warm lamp, the steaming coffee mug still sitting on the desk. All the corporate veneer of polite banking vanished in an instant, replaced by a desperate, sharp-edged malice. "There is no private property here, Caleb," Henderson spat out, stepping right up to me, his breath smelling faintly of peppermint and expensive scotch. "This entire ridge was condemned by municipal eminent domain back in '98. Your father was a squatter running an illegal hazard on county land. Where is he?" "My father died in a fire 20 years ago, remember?" I replied, keeping my voice chillingly calm, deliberately shifting my weight to ensure the floor seam remained completely flush and hidden beneath my boots. "At least, that's what your family's insurance payout claimed. If someone is living out here now, they've got better title rights than a bank president trespassing with a sledgehammer." Henderson's jaw tightened so hard a muscle twitched near his temple. He signaled furiously to the deputies. "Search the house. Tear up the floorboards if you have to. Find the structural ledgers from the 56 Dam Project. They're here and I want them." The two deputies fanned out instantly, marching down the hall toward the kitchen and the workshop, their heavy boots thudding against the timber framing. Brenda Gable stood frozen by the front entrance, her phone still clutched in her hand, her lens pointed straight at Henderson. "You might want to watch your step, Thomas," Brenda said, her voice dripping with a dangerous, icy calm. "Every word you're saying right now is streaming live to the State Environmental Protection Office and 3 major regional newspapers. If your deputies damage a single historical landmark on this property, The bankruptcy court won't just take your bank. They'll take the shirt off your back. Henderson whipped his head around to glare at Brenda, his face turning a mottled shade of crimson. You are interfering with a municipal security operation. Brenda, put that phone away or you'll find your real estate license revoked before sunset. Try it. Brenda replied smoothly, stepping closer to the door, keeping her framing steady. The State Attorney General's office has been looking into the Ashwood Water Authority's structural audit reports since Tuesday. They're already on the turnpike. Before Henderson could lunge toward her, a muffled, metallic clank echoed from beneath the floorboards right where I was standing, a sound so distinct that even the deputies stopped their search down the hall. Henderson's eyes snapped back to me, locking onto my boots with sudden, absolute terror. The sharp, metallic clank echoed from beneath the floorboards, cutting through the tense atmosphere of the hallway like a knife. For 3 heartbeats, nobody moved. The deputies froze by the doorway of the workshop, their flashlights hovering midair. Brenda held her phone steady, the red recording light blinking silently in the dim air. Thomas Henderson stared down at my boots, his face draining of all color until he looked like a corpse caught in a headlight's beam. What was that? The lead deputy demanded, looking back and forth between Henderson and me, his hand resting firmly on the grip of his holster. Mr. Henderson, what's underneath this floor? Nothing. Henderson snapped, his voice cracking sharply. It's settling. Old timber settling on a concrete foundation. Arrest him. Arrest him for trespassing and interference. You can't arrest someone for standing on their own land, Thomas. A deep, raspy voice echoed from the hallway floor itself. The sliding wooden panel beneath my feet shifted slightly, a cool draft of subterranean air rushing up into the warm hallway. Before the deputies could react, the panel slid completely open, and my father emerged from the dark stone stairwell. He wasn't carrying an old suitcase or running away. In his right hand, he held a heavy, water-resistant steel cylinder containing the original, unredacted 1956 stress calculations and engineering maps for the Ashwood Dam. Henderson lurched backward as if he had seen a ghost, stumbling against a hallway table and knocking a framed picture to the floor where it shattered into pieces. Daniel, Henderson whispered, his voice trembling uncontrollably. You were supposed to be gone. I was gone, Thomas, my father said, stepping up out of the stairwell, standing shoulder to shoulder with me, his pale blue eyes fixed entirely on the panicked banker. I was dead on paper so you and your father could cover up the fact that the spillway foundation was built with substandard concrete to pocket the municipal surplus. Lies. All lies. Henderson shrieked, lunging forward with a desperate, wild motion, trying to snatch the steel cylinder from my father's hands. He didn't even get close. With a smooth, practiced motion, the lead deputy stepped in, grabbed Henderson's arm, and twisted behind his back with a sharp click of steel handcuffs. Mr. Henderson, you have a right to remain silent, the deputy recited calmly, the irony hanging thick in the air. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. As Henderson was dragged screaming and kicking out the front door toward the waiting cruisers, the distant, steady wail of state police sirens began to echo up through the winding mountain roads from the valley below, signaling the arrival of the Attorney General's investigators. The sun finally broke through the heavy autumn clouds outside, casting a brilliant, warm amber light across the front porch and the pine forest beyond. My father looked down at the steel cylinder in his hands, then turned his gaze slowly toward me. We have a lot of bridge building to catch up on, Caleb, he said softly, a faint, genuine smile touching the corners of his mouth. I looked at the house, at the ridge, and at the man who had sacrificed 20 years of his life in the dark to protect a town that didn't know how to save itself. I reached out, taking the steel cylinder from his hand, and nodded toward the open door. Yeah, Dad, I replied, the bitterness of 20 years finally washing away in the mountain air. Let's start with a new foundation.